Hi everyone, it's Ren here, you know who it is, and in this video we will be talking about the question of the relationship between being and language in open monism. Because as you might have noticed, in the last 12 episodes or something, like essentially since the beginning, I've been very focused on the question of open metaphysics, and I've spent like a really significant amount of time digging into the metaphysical basis of open monism, to the extent that somebody who has only watched the videos and is not following my blog, where I post my entries, might think that it's only about metaphysics, but actually it's not. It's only that I wanted to have the sturdiest possible metaphysical foundation to then deploy the other aspects of the system. And in this video, I'll be transitioning towards the relationship between metaphysics and language. Being, it's tripartite aspectuality, which you're familiar with, being as content, being as structure, being as reality. And our language, when I speak, when you speak with other people, right? In my writing, this relationship is actually quite important, and I consider that language is one of the primary evidential tanks of the open monism framework. Like, we can find evidence for things to say about being in our attempts to phenomenologically describe being, describe what it is, and its three aspects, by a close analysis, by paying close attention, not only at the world around us, but also at what language we use to describe this world, okay? And just to give you a tiny bit of context, the reason why I became interested in this relationship between language and being is that I was fascinated with two authors. You already know, if you watch some of my previous videos, that I'm big into Heidegger and also Wittgenstein, and in some respects, sometimes I present my work as trying to operate some kind of reconciliation or blending of both authors. It's not quite the correct term, but there is that idea in open monism, and both Heidegger and Wittgenstein had very interesting things to say about language and being, or language and the world, right? So Heidegger has this beautiful quotes in which he says, language is the house of being. So it's like a mysterious quote, something that I've been trying to entangle for a long time, because I think there is a grain of truth to it. There's in terms of like my intuition, I feel like there's something about it. And Wittgenstein is well known for saying, the limits of my language are the limits of my world, which is also a famous quote. To have discussed it on a forum not long ago, I've come to realize that the reason why I'm really interested in that quote and why I'm still fascinated by it is that it seems to be true, and at the same time not true. Depending on how you understand the quote, it's not true, in the sense that it's probably not true that all that we think about is linguistic. However, it's quite possible that anything that's constitutes our world can be expressed by means of language in some way, perhaps not perfectly, but can be symbolized. And that provided the sort of background for what I decided to operate, which is this attempt at seeing how being is reflected in language, mirrored in language. Sometimes I talk about the mirroring of being in language. So I'm not going to say language is the house of being, because that's already been taken by Heidegger. Sometimes I like to say that language is the voice of being. That's a nice way to put it. But it will be an informal thing, some catchy thing. Essentially, what I want to discuss here is in what way is it the case that language reflects being? Well, now that we have established our tripartite aspectuality of being, let's just return to it, Let's return to the question of the reality of being, the content of being, and the structure of being, and let's see how these are, I think, reflected in language. Well, first of all, the reality of being, logical conceivability, very simple. What you talk about is always, by definition, about something. Language is about something. It cannot be about nothing, and then that leads us to the other famous quote by Wittgenstein, who says, "What cannot be talked about must be passed over in silence." That's exactly the idea. So, if reality or limits of being represents the realm of the logically conceivable, this realm is exactly the same as relates to language. Anything that is logically conceivable should be possible to express in language. The logically inconceivable cannot be expressed in language. Okay, so there is a perfect relationship of mirroring in the case of the being as reality. First aspect, easily disposed of. Second aspect, a little bit tougher. The being as content. Okay, well, being as content, as you remember, is immanence and has 5 attributes. So let's just literally take one attribute after the other and try to see in what way these attributes are reflected in our language. First attribute, being as intimacy. So you remember, I'm not going to go into the detail of that again because there's a whole video dedicated to the 5 attributes, but being as intimacy is simply, well, in language, it means that like any word that we use is attached to something, right? There's no like hollow like word. Like words that we use, insofar as we use them, have a referent. The sign involves a signified and a signifier. The signifier is the word, and the signified is what the word refers to. So, for example, the bottle, you know this bottle by now. The bottle is this, but the signifier is the word bottle that I'm pronouncing. There's an intimate connection between the word as a sign and what it refers to, right? To such an extent that like we don't operate that distinction between like the signifier and the signified all the time when we practice language. When we are engaged in linguistic activity, we take this intimacy for granted. But at a metaphysical level and at a linguistic level, there's correspondence. Silent infinity, second attribute of immanence. Anything that I'm saying about this bottle, potentially I could enrich it massively in the very same proposition with sub parts that would give a hell of a lot more detail about the bottle. And that applies to anything whatsoever. Myself, the day, what's going to happen tomorrow. Whatever you say, you could say something. It can be truthful. It can be false. But let's say that you say something truthful. Well, you could have added detail. It's implied in what you're saying. You don't have to voice it. Reflects the silent infinity of being at the level of immanence. Third aspect, the aspect of givenness. Well, the aspect of givenness is quite simple. The fact that when I use language, I keep, language seems to follow the track of time in a way. I speak, and there are words that come out of my mouth, and they describe a certain kind of sequence, right? And the words occur and make themselves available to me, and I use them, and this is how language unfolds. So language unfolds in time, and I may also add that like a language comes always equipped with the possibility of describing new things that take place and become part of our lives with new words that describe these things, right? So for example, you could say that, well, capitalism used not to exist, right? The system of social and economic relations called capitalism did not exist in the Middle Ages or in the classical age. You might say, well, at some point it began existing and the word for it was used. So if you like, intimacy sticks things together, and in correlation with givenness, this produces what we sometimes see as new things happening and having new words for them immediately, and it's never possible for us to quite tell when the word was associated with the thing. So that is an illustration of givenness in language, reflects givenness of immanence. Foldedness, immanent foldedness, fourth attribute. Well, again, it's actually not so hard. if you look at the bottle that I showed earlier, right? So you look at this bottle, I look at it. We agree that there is this bottle. It's only one thing, and there's only one word for it, the bottle. Of course, we could use another word, but it would still be a word that we share in common. And yes, the way that you experience this bottle with your perception is actually slightly different than my perception of it. It is colored by your stance, by your point of view, you know. So I don't want to use the word consciousness, or anything that sounds too Cartesian is banned for me, but your perception and experience of this bottle has all in common with mine, but it also has things that are peculiar to your position. And this is reflected by your position as a unity of fact in immanent space. So there's, again, a perfect mirroring of immanent foldedness and foldedness in language, because you're going to be talking about this bottle in a different way that I am. When you speak about it, or when you speak about anything whatsoever, you're going to refer to it, and I'm going to be referring to it. We'll be referring to the same things, or we'll be referring to the same situations, we'll be referring to the same events, but we will use different words. And that corresponds to different foldings, right? Different interpretations of theories, different interpretations of many things, okay? Foldedness, fourth attribute reflected in language. Now, the fifth attribute, again, usually the most complex, is recursiveness. Since here I'm really interested mostly in ordinary human language, which is the one that I'm most familiar with, that I practice, let's focus on like language as the activity of a second order being, right? Human being. So presumably the mirroring here at the level of recursiveness will be a mirroring with second order or higher order recursiveness of immanence. Well, I think it's actually quite straightforward, you know. If you wake up every day and like you sort of try to look at your manipulation of language, you will notice that by and large the same structures and the same kind of content tends to be repeated every day. Like there is a certain level of repetition with variation to the way you speak and to what you speak. Your practice of language has a clear pattern that repeats itself every day. The sameness that we can sometimes experience in our reality is reflected in this sameness of language, and the variations that happen in our reality and the new opportunities that happen in our reality despite this background of relative recursive sameness is perfectly reflected in our language. Again, given us gives a new situation that was not known before, language finds a new word for it. So it's not completely repetitive. It's not deterministically repetitive, but at the same time it is recursively second order recursive. Repetitive within bounds, actually porous bounds, not strict bounds. And it is impossible to quite predict. Obviously, it's impossible to quite predict what will be said. Okay, so you can see that here there is again a correspondence between the attributes of immanent recursion and linguistic recursion. So we have established that the aspect of reality is perfectly mirrored in our use of language. The 5 attributes of immanence are mirrored in our use of language, and I will finish this expose with the question of being a structure in our language. So as you remember, the depth of structure is open-groundedness, and so the question that we want to ask ourselves now is like, how is open-groundedness reflected in a language? Well, again, it's actually quite simple. You know, if you're a user of language, which you are, since you're listening to my video, I think that you can relate with me insofar as both you and me we're not users of language in a vacuum. We cannot remember a moment when we began to use language and the words came out of our mouths and there was nothing around us. We have always been deeply immersed in a linguistic context, right? Well, this represents our ground. We have a stance, which is like the voice that we speak as part of that context, and that is our own. But at the same time, we have to operate with a super vast and enormously complicated, to again use the word of Wittgenstein, web of conventions and linguistic usages and words and terminology that are constantly around us, right? We're not using language in a vacuum. There is a ground. At the same time, we are always learning new words. When we have conversations with other people, we discover new things via language, and we are able to use them for ourselves, colored by our own folding of them as we proceed through life. people that we talk to, people that we communicate with, will also embrace and absorb some of our own uses, some of our own words, some of our own linguistic conceptions. And that represents obviously mutual openness to one another from a stance which is grounded, right, in this context, in this linguistic space, and at the same time open to the acquisition of new information, for instance, of new linguistic constructions, of literally new languages, as in new tongues, speaking English, speaking French, speaking, you can start tomorrow learning Russian if you want to. So this is yet another illustration of linguistic openness. But it's always going to be from a ground. In fact, for example, your linguistic ground could be your accent, that it will be, as you can see for myself, very difficult to get rid of. There will always be a tiny part of Frenchness in my accent. It's strong in my case, will be weaker in other cases. But funny enough, this is also part of the ground, which is constantly interacting with the openness, okay? And we have covered all the different aspects of being and all their subtleties, in fact, and how they are reflected in our language, right? So maybe after all these long videos on open metaphysics were useful, because now we can operate with a clear understanding of what open metaphysics is. And I hope that I have been somewhat convincing in showing to you that language in our world is actually the voice of being, which means, and you will see that in the next videos, that I can also use the analysis of language and analysis of linguistic use and structure to lead my analysis and my investigation into the recesses of the complexity of being. Thank you guys. See you next time.